Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know we have participants from both sides of the Atlantic, maybe across the globe from where I am in the Northeast of the United States right now. But thank you for joining us today. Here with a great panel of Max Ed Money and Jordan McKee from Riskified and S&P 451 Research, respectively. My name is Andrew Sogren. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at IXOPAY, a payment orchestration company with a footprint in Vienna and here in the United States. And first, I'll hand it off to Max to introduce himself.
Hello, everyone, and hi, Andrew. Hi, Jordan. It's great to be here with you, and thank you for having me. I'm Max Ed Money, Head of Partnerships at Riskified. Riskified is a global leader in online fraud detection. We partner with some of the world's largest retailers to automate fraud decisions in real time. And our platform doesn't just detect fraud, we guarantee our decisions against fraud and chargebacks as well. Jordan, over to you.
Thanks so much, Max. Thank you, Andrew. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. My name is Jordan McKee. I'm the Director of the FinTech Research and Advisory Practice at 451 Research, part of S&P Global. I've been in I initiated coverage of the payments industry for 451 back in 2013. And as an analyst, spend most of my time looking at innovation and emerging tech impacting the acceptance side of the payments business and working with enterprises on payment strategy and optimization. And we'll get into a lot of those observations that we've made covering this space just a few moments here. It's great to be here today.
And I'll just say that as a bit of an old hand in the payment token and orchestration space, been working for Jordan for years. He's been with us since the 2010s, covering orchestration and its development and implementation across the globe. So great to have you both on here today. And I'll be player coaching, moderating, jumping in. But let's get into what we're covering today. So what we'll start with is some of the market insights and research that Jordan and his team put together. If you haven't seen some of the research output, 451 is a really high quality output of both market research, especially around enterprise merchants, as well as analysis, so making sense of it. We're having him wear both of those hats today on the panel, but we'll be covering a lot of the research that he's done over the past year here. What we referred to as the what as we were preparing for this. Then we'll move into some of the strategies that we're seeing. How if we're first looking at what's happening in the market, the middle portion of our webinar today will be looking at the strategies to build resiliency and adaptivity into your payment stack, into your risk programs. And then lastly, what we called the where, and where are we going to go from here? Maybe this is the first 2026 predictions webinar you've been on. Probably won't be the last, but we'll get into some of that forward-looking planning, and we'd love to hear from you too. So we have the chat open. Park some of your questions there because we want to make this presentation your own. So with that, into the market trends and insights from payments, performance, and fraud. Again, a lot of the research you'll see today is from Jordan's voice of the enterprise merchant customer here. And so with that, Jordan, why don't I hand it over to you?
That sounds great, Andrew. Thank you for that tee up. And that's right. So Q2 of each year, we go out into the field and knock on the doors of roughly 500 payments and commerce technology decision makers and enterprises across a variety of verticals and really look to get a pulse check on their payment strategy, their payment roadmap, and what they're prioritizing within their business. And the interesting thing here is, and this is a great place to start, by the way, because the interesting realization that we see in this research and just anecdotally in our conversations is that as businesses grow, what they often find is the payment infrastructure they have in place is often more a reflection of where that business was at, not necessarily where it wants to head in the future. That payment stack that served a business very well in a specific phase of growth can quickly become a bottleneck in the next phase of growth if you're not keeping up with it. And what we so often see is that as businesses are looking to execute on that growth plan that they've set forth, they really start to see the need for modern payment capabilities come to the forefront. They're thinking about entering new geographic markets. Now they're thinking more about local payment method connectivity. They're thinking about local acquiring. They're thinking about FX capabilities. Perhaps they have some business model innovation in the works. They want to spin up a new subscription business line. Now they're thinking more about network tokens. They're thinking about building a smart retry strategy. Maybe they're seeing some emphasis from the finance department to improve their operating margins. Suddenly they're thinking more about routing. They're thinking more about their payment method mix. And you see good evidence of that here in this chart. Merchants are telling us their current acceptance infrastructure is a top 3 growth inhibitor for their business. It actually rises to the #1 inhibitor for merchants that are playing in more than 3 geographic regions, really underscores the complexity of managing payments globally at a significant scale, and just incredible to see the pain felt from acceptance infrastructure, outpacing areas like culture, like staffing, a number of other areas on this chart here. So I think the punchline is that merchants are increasingly aware that the payment infrastructure they have today can often limit what they're looking to achieve tomorrow.
And as someone who's checked out this report of yours for many years now, I get why logistics and supply chain. I mean, if you just open a newspaper and you saw even the impact of digital assets over, the whisper of increased tariffs in the last week or two, just the knock-on effects. But the payment infrastructure, the data question, those seem like perennial leaders. And so are there any nuances of within those categories that are particular pain points right now for merchants or that are really keeping them in that top spot?
Yeah, I think you characterize that perfectly. Given the geopolitical environment, we'd expect to see logistics and supply chain registering as a top concern. Really more of a cyclical, I think, than a structural trend surfacing there. And then you contrast that with data infrastructure, payment infrastructure, which feel much more secular. Both of those are tied to digital transformation. They're tied to the digitization of industries, and I think also intertwined in a number of ways. Payments is such a rich source of customer and operational insight that so many enterprises want to harness more effectively. And so maybe that's something I would pull out of that observation, that more and more enterprises are thinking critically about how can we get our arms around our payments data and drive optimization from that insight that these transactions are spinning off for our business.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I'm right with you that managing customer data and payment acceptance infrastructure are more like maybe 1.5 categories than 2 distinct ones here. But of course, I'm so rotated into payments, it's easy for me to say that. See payments everywhere. And so from that perspective, one of the other elements of this study talked about payments as highly strategic, as a focus for the business this year and going forward. So could you elaborate a little bit on this piece of data?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe to dovetail with the previous slide, right? Why are more and more merchants recognizing gaps in their payment acceptance strategy? I think the answer, and you sort of alluded to that, Andrew, is payments have become fashionable over the past, call it 10 or so years. There's this mindset shift that's occurring around the role and the business value of payments in the enterprise. And I think the realization is that, yeah, of course, cost needs to be managed. It always needs to be managed in the context of payments. But payments today are as much about cost as they are about the customer experience you're delivering as a business. They're as much about the growth trajectory of your organization. And I think the reason is because what we've really seen as more customer interactions have shifted into digital channels, payments have become that inflection point of the customer journey. They're that stage when your prospect, which you probably spend a tremendous amount of money as a business to get them to that point. You've thrown money up the funnel on marketing and advertising. You've invested in your digital experience. That's all great. You finally got that prospect to the point where you want them. They're about to become a customer. Everything feels like it's going as planned, but there's so much that can go wrong at that payment stage. The customer may experience a false decline. They may not be able to pay with their preferred payment method. They may get discouraged by all the steps in the checkout form. And if one of those things goes wrong, every investment you've made further up the funnel in a lot of ways was squandered if that customer abandons at that step. And so I really think of payments as just such a critical input into growth and CX. And I think those that separate themselves from the pack get that. They get that payments are a strategic asset. And it comes to life here in the data. The message is resonating. About 3/4 of enterprises today approaching payments as a strategic lever for their business. And that's up almost 20 points since we launched this survey at the start of the decade.
That's exactly one of the things that Max is going to touch on a little bit later is everything that goes up to cart fulfillment, checkout conversion, getting that to authorization, like pulling that over the line after you've invested so much in acquisition, design, and a smooth customer experience. And I'm going to make a note to my editor that we get to quote Jordan that payments is finally fashionable. I'm going to be using that line at parties this holiday season, and it makes sense, especially when we see some of the high-profile developments and the expansion that enterprises are engaging in across the globe right now. So this one takes a little bit of unpacking, but it's actually one of my favorite slides here, and where what you're doing is contrasting organizations that feel that they've achieved a balance between fraud prevention and user experience on the bottom here, versus in a just absolute growth in fraud volume on the top here. And what you can see is that these 2 points over on the right here are actually at their widest place that they've been in. Like they've never been further apart since you've started collecting data about 5-6 years ago here. So how can you help us make sense of this and get into some of the drivers here?
Sure. You can't have a conversation about payment strategy today without considering the implications of fraud. That's why we're so happy Max is with us on the line today. These topics are inextricably intertwined. And very similarly, if you're only approaching fraud through the lens of loss reduction, you really fail to take into account how fraud prevention is impacting the totality of your business, your customer experience, your growth trajectory. And you see evidence of that here. So the red line that you're looking at, that's fraud volume growth. Roughly 60-70% of merchants reporting year-over-year increases in online fraudulent transaction volume experienced by their business since the turn of the decade. The blue line is the percent of merchants that believe they're effectively balancing their fraud prevention and their user experience priorities. And generally what we're seeing, fewer than a third of merchants believe they're doing that effectively today. And the takeaway that I pull out of that is, you look at the relationship between these lines, and as fraud volume is increasing, merchants are becoming reactive. Fraud volumes go up, the balance between preventative efforts and user experience preservation goes down. And the reality is this, so many merchants are responding to elevated fraud by introducing friction. They might be creating blanket policies that negatively impact their most loyal customers. Maybe they're getting killed by return abuse, so they decide to pull their lifetime guarantee, or they're doing things like outright blocking cards or IP addresses from certain markets where they're seeing fraud stemming from. Those approaches eat into the customer experience, and that actually registers as the top concern that merchants tell us they have about the impact of fraud on their business today. It outpaces even losses, fraud management costs. They're laser focused on that CX impact. And I think the message to me is fraud today is a CX problem, in a lot of ways, first and foremost. The nut that you need to crack is really about deepening your understanding of identity and intent and trust. That's what starts to convert fraud prevention into more of a CX and a growth lever for your business.
And actually, that what I hear is going back up to this customer data element that we had as number 2 in the major growth inhibitors earlier. And so, Max, are you picking up what Jordan's putting down there? Would you elaborate on anything?
I think Jordan is spot on. When fraud hits hard, merchants tighten rules, right? But when you do that, you are, like you said, generalizing your entire base. And even though you may be successful at containing the fraud issue temporarily, it's still going to come at a cost, and it's going to be your customer experience is going to be damaged, right? So we see that time and time again at Riskified as well. And that's why, they come to us. And I think Jordan has another stat later on, and sorry for the spoiler, Jordan, but that it says that 1 in 5 customers will stop shopping with a merchant if they experience a false decline, right? And that's what happens when you start increasing or tightening the rules that you have in place. So I think another stat that we have is that false declines actually cost merchants up to 75 times more than the fraud costs themselves. So the message here is to customize the fraud flows based on the concept of identity confidence, right? And this is something I'll come back to many times in this webinar as well. So something looks risky or coming from an unknown shopper or source, you can add friction there specifically to that transaction or shopper. But make sure that your loyal, lower risk shoppers will continue to have a frictionless, smooth experience buying with you.
And identity confidence, as you just said, great term, going to steal that one, is going to be just as relevant in this agentic commerce age as for establishing identity with the cardholders too. So as we round out this first section of just the market, right, setting the landscape here, what we heard is that payments are a growth inhibitor, that payments are getting the strategic buy-in from the top of the organization as an area worthy of investment. And then lastly, we've been seeing that even as they're getting this mind share, or because payments are getting this mind share because of this of enterprises seeing higher fraud volumes, but also feeling less confident that they're balancing the user experience with fraud controls here. And so, Max, when you hear about payments as a growth inhibitor, you hear about lack of balance with fraud controls. What do you recommend, or what do you hear when you hear enterprise merchant customers bringing those things up?
Yeah, look, I think that the first bullet is connected to the second as well, right? And it comes down to adaptivity and to optimize fraud and transaction fees and acceptance rates. And so that's the concept of, again, building and buying instead of a decision between build versus buy. And I just made a point right about customizing fraud flows based on the identity risk instead of a generic blanket static rule. And you can apply the same concept to transaction fees and auth rates, right? Or how you're going to customize to optimize those as well. Meaning you can smart route the right orders, right, to the right processors, the ones with the best fees and the highest acceptance rates. And based on, and that's going to be connected to the profile of that order or the identity, I should say. And we're going to go later as well into the how portion, right? And we're going to be able to show some visuals of examples of how you can use our tools and these tools to customize those flows.
And Jordan, on this third piece about resiliency, flexibility, composability in payments is one of my favorite terms that you and your team use. So what do you see as ways that your enterprise merchant customers and clients are addressing this?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's come up a few times already today. Data management is a top enterprise-wide challenge. You saw that a few slides ago. But when we specifically ask, the head of payments, a payments manager, for their key challenges facing, their sort of operating function, data management surfaces as well, right? Improving payment analytics capabilities is the number 2 priority for payments teams at the moment. It's been interesting that has sort of crept up the list over the years as we've been running this study. And really what we're seeing there is just a greater appetite for easy to consume insight on payments performance, on things like cost observability. There's appetite for more modernized dashboards that anybody across the business can use and access in real time. And a lot of pain is traditionally felt there. You're seeing lots of one-off analyses that really sapped the bandwidth of payments teams. And I think the realization is before you can optimize your payment stack, you really need insights and intelligence to guide you. And so most of the strategic efforts in payments, I think in a lot of ways, ultimately index back to the ability to consume data, quality data, and mechanisms that you have in place to harness that data and act on it.
So I can't just rely on vibes for building my payment stack. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, you can try your best, but you're only going to get so far on that.
Oh, great. Well, let's move into our next section here about that resilient composable payment stack here. And so Jordan, again, handing it off to you as we get into some of the data elements here about multiprocessor. But I think I'd invite our crew here in the audience to think of multiprocessor, but also multi-partner, because as you see just from the people in front of you with IXOPAY as an orchestration layer, Max and the Riskified team, it's not just multiprocessor, but really multi-partner ecosystems that you can build here. So Jordan, would love to hear you just explore this slide in front of us now.
Yeah, I agree. I think multi-processor and as you say, multi-partner is really the reality of the enterprise market. It all goes back to composability. It goes back to building a stack for your business that's tailored specifically to the requirements that you have as an organization. And if you look specifically at multi-processor, right? So 90% of merchants that we surveyed have more than one processing partner under the hood. The larger, the more e-commerce centric that merchant is, the greater the likelihood they have multiple processing integrations. And I think the reason for that, if you really distill it, it's fairly simple. As merchants mature and look to align their payment strategy more closely with the business goals that they have as an enterprise, they realize very quickly that no single provider can deliver everything they need as an organization. I was talking to the head of payments at a large hospitality business a few weeks back, and he put it perfectly to me. We're multi-processor because no single processor is truly global and does everything well, right? It's as simple as that. And so different processors at the end of the day, they're bringing different strengths into your organization. And so really the natural evolution for enterprise merchants, I think, is to build a payment stack that's flexible, that's diversified, that's purpose-built for their business, instead of just pulling something off the shelf and trying to make it fit into the goals and the requirements that you have as an organization.
We were I was in New York City for a customer event that we were running last week, and eBanks was good enough to be on site with us, and their team member there was just talking about that aha moment, like that light bulb moment, when somebody who's been used to working with a full stack international processor actually localizes a payment partner, and what they see immediately is a shot in the arm to costs, acceptance rates, with some local acquiring relationships, the ease of setting up a local payment method, and it is this just like light bulb moment for them as they see what's in front of them there.
Yeah, it can be shocking, right? If you don't understand the opportunity in front of you, it's very easy to overlook how simple it can be to expand your partner ecosystem in the impact that can have on your business from an integration standpoint, from a customer localization standpoint, and everything in between.
And so you've already teased out a few of these, but as we think about why this multiple partner, multi-processor ecosystem is just gaining a lot more attention, what are some of the big drivers that you see about it? Is it more we were sort of forced into this? Is it maybe that's we had to do multiple integrations, but all of a sudden we're learning how to make all these integrations play well together? We're optimizing, to use a charged word.
What we see in the research is that merchants aren't adopting multi-processor setups just out of necessity anymore. And to your comments, I mean, that perhaps could have been the case for some time, but what we're seeing increasingly is a clear strategic shift in mindset. And we've really seen this become the preferred operating model for most enterprises. Preference for multi-processor, you see this in the line chart here, grown from 50% in 23 to 62% this year. And so the way I reconcile this slide with the previous slide is that while nearly all enterprises are multi-processor, a majority of them actually prefer it. They're not multi-processor just because they feel like they have to be. It's because they see it as the preferred way to build a payment stack for their business. And then you look at the bar chart that unpacks the drivers. And if I distill that a little bit, first and foremost, it's about flexibility. Merchants are looking to reduce lock-in. They want to retain leverage. And so the ability to shift volumes can do a lot of great things for their business. It can give them negotiating power. It can increase agility. It can insulate them in the event of an unfavorable development. Maybe it's a processor that shifts their risk tolerances, or it's a processor that gets acquired. And we've seen so much of that over the past few years. Second, it's about global reach. Exactly as you alluded to in your example, Andrew. It's thinking about multi-processor as a means of more effectively expanding into new markets, supporting local payment methods, working with regional acquirers that really know the terrain at a granular level. Third, it's about best of breed performance. And we talked a little bit about this. A single provider is rarely going to check every single box that you have for your business. You might love WorldPay for its prime debit routing product, but you want to rely on Stripe for local payment method connectivity. And then finally, it's about optimization, and that could be driving costs down. It could be improving auth rates. It could be running champion challenger testing. Having multiple processors is really giving you that freedom to continually refine your payments performance and optimize it to the greatest degree possible. So, to tie a bow around it, it's not just about redundancy. It's not just about necessity. It's about strategy increasingly. And I think multi-processor we've seen really become this deliberate lever for control and performance and growth for merchants that are thinking about it in that context.
And I see a lot of elements that touch on top line here, bottom line, or are just about flexibility, right? I mean, the leader there, to steal the term, but really are about just building agility into the stack itself, as opposed to a specific way to increase my margins, right?
Yeah, I think agility is the perfect word for it, right? Agility and adaptability. It's about building a payment stack that allows you to move as quick as the market does, to respond to your customers' needs as quickly as they're evolving. And the more partners you have in your ecosystem, and the better you've optimized the use of those partners, the more easily you can respond to those shifts that you're seeing unfold.
And so as we think about merchants, of course, here, we're looking at $100 million or more in annual revenue here. In terms of the issues associated with multi-processor payments, what are some of the limiting factors here? Is there a low ceiling on a multi-processor environment, or multiple partners here? What does the voice of the market say?
Yeah, I think the obvious byproduct of multi-processor is complexity. And you know this well, right? As a merchant, if you haven't optimized your multi-processor environment, you've got more integrations to manage. You're getting all these fragmented data files. You've got a need to maybe have to go out and build your own rules engine for routing. It can create a tremendous amount of overhead for a payments team. No surprise, what we see in this study, about 3 in 5 merchants telling us their business needs to reduce the time that developers are spending on payment functions. And I think a lot of that, can be tied back to some of the pain that's been traditionally felt around multi-processor. It can very quickly consume, what at the end of the day are very precious resources across the enterprise. Resources that arguably would be better spent and deliver higher ROI elsewhere in the business. And so the response to that complexity is payment orchestration, right? It's this operating system in a lot of ways for your payment stack. It's a means of streamlining those integrations. It's a means of centralizing analytics and token management and deployment of routing rules and logic, and really allows you as a merchant to more easily drive optimizations across that multi-processor stack and really try to derive the intended value out of your payments partner ecosystem that you've stitched together. And it frees up your payments team, right? Your payments team is focused less on a lot of that operational minutia, more ideally on strategy and roadmap as a result of bringing an orchestration capability into the enterprise. And you see good emphasis on this here. 73% of enterprises telling us that payment orchestration is highly strategic to meeting the long-term e-commerce needs of the business. So I think of payment orchestration really as the logical evolution of multiprocessor. It's about maximizing business value, maximizing the impact of that estate that you've pulled together.
And building on that concept of orchestration, as we're still establishing a market for it, even a working definition for it, what we've seen is traditionally in the voice of the market, there's this idea that an orchestration platform is completely end to end, right? That if you're in for a penny, you're in for a pound, limited to those connections. But earlier, Max teased out the concept of build and buy, and I think some of those borders that used to be extremely strong are starting to come down a little bit. I mean, I almost think about it the way of with all the projects around the house, there's some things I love doing, right? Like I like mowing the lawn, power washing the cedar shed. Not really, that's not my forte. I'm probably going to break something, maybe hurt someone. So I'll call that in. Got no problem calling that in. But you do have payment teams who have close expertise and get to decide where they both want to and can make the most difference, but also bring in providers here too. So one of the things we're seeing in the market is what build and buy actually looks like, and that merchants can create that environment together. And so with that in mind, I know we have a lot of moving parts on this slide, but what we wanted to do is give Max the microphone to talk about what composability looks like when you actually break down the contributing parts here.
Yeah, I think from a payments perspective and even from a merchant perspective, right? Everything you and Andrew and Jordan you covered makes total sense, right? For merchants to have a processor set up from a transaction fee perspective, auth rates, right? Just having that available to you the easiest way possible without having to dedicate too many dev resources. From a fraud perspective, however, right, the risk profile of a specific transaction doesn't change depending on the processor. It's disconnected to that. And Riskified will collect the same data points. We're going to analyze the same data points, and it's all about that identity and the risk level associated with that order. But what changes here, right, are a couple of things, and I'm talking about the Riskified piece there on the left-hand side. With a combination of orchestration services in place, right, we are allowed to perform a pre-auth risk assessment of that order. And when we were talking about this webinar as well before, I alluded to this. I told you guys, before we're used to customers coming to us, regular retailers. Of course, this is going to vary, but it would come to us with a 92-95% approval rate, and they were happy, right, if they would get a 2-3% bump from Riskified. And now we have customers that we are giving them 99% approval rate, and they're asking us, what can we do to get us closer to 99.8? And so we got to squeeze more out of this, right? And a way for them to do this is to customize those flows like I talked about. So going pre-auth, you can do it. You can accomplish a couple of things. Number one is you make sure that your green traffic, your loyal customers, like I keep repeating, they go through without any sort of friction, right? They don't even see what's happening behind the scenes. That's very important. The second thing is this is also going to allow merchants, right, to tap into that gray area. So you want to take a little bit more risk, or be more accurate in the type of risk that you're taking. You can apply some friction to specific orders or customers, right? You want to maybe trigger 3D Secure. You maybe want to do a 2FA check on that shopper as well. And you just want to do a pre-auth decline because then you're filtering out any bad traffic from hitting the issuer, which again, down the line is going to help you with your auth rates. And Andrew, I'll let you talk about the transaction routing perspective of this.
Well, I'll jump into that in a second, but what I'm hearing is that, so in real time, you can set up these friction layers. It's not as if before this person ever came to the site, they were all in place, where we're going to ask them for a CVV or a 2FA or a 3DS. So something like that, right? This is...
Exactly. The way that we perform our decisions, and again, Riskified provides binary approve or decline decisions. And whenever we say we're approving something, we're standing behind that decision and we're guaranteeing it for against fraudulent chargebacks, right? So we have to be very accurate, which means there's a massive depth of data that we collect to make those decisions. But as merchants push more and more towards let's optimize, right? This is a dangerous word nowadays, but let's get more out of this, and can you collect even more data after the fact, right? To be able to challenge a potential decline is what we're talking about here. So that's the real-time piece of this. Whatever we are certain or taking already some risk, because that's the business we're in, we are approving those transactions without any issue. But if we see a transaction that is in that gray area, again, real time, right? We're not 100% sure that this is blatant fraud, or also not 100% sure that this is legitimate, then there's something we can add to that transaction. It could be, again, some sort of friction that we can add to that order. And then we can overturn a potential decline into an approval.
Got it. So yeah, this adaptivity element that's being built in. And so to go back to it, so this is all happening pre-auth on the Riskified layer, moving into what our platform and other orchestration providers can offer, or merchants can build this themselves, right? Jordan, I'm sure you work with companies that have built an IXOPAY in-house, or their version of that. That really picks up at checkout to securely ingest the payment details, do some quick identifiers on the bin about where the issuer is located, what's the payment method, and then make a routing decision based on that. This is a U.S. card, so dLocal as one of our primary partners in Latin America, probably not going to use that for the transaction, but we, like Braintree, will maybe have some failover to Adyen and route the payment that way. So you can see layers of providers are embedded here, with Riskified both opening this element and then also closing it with a chargeback guarantee. IXOPAY identifying or providing structured data around the payment method, the transaction, and then being the connectivity layer to downstream processing partners and acquirers, as you see here. So this is just a simple mock-up of what composability can look like, and your mileage may vary depending on exactly how you want to structure this for the business. And so to wrap up this section here, building for composability and what that means. We showed you that example just a moment ago about how Riskified can sit above processing partners alongside an orchestration layer, so you can get that visibility and scope over and above the direct services that you might be getting for a processor, whose gateway level risk checks or 3DS might be exactly what you need in certain circumstances, but that are able to get improved on in other ways. And so, Max, Jordan, as we wrap up this section, anything else to give to the audience to take away?
I'd echo your comments on composability. I think this is really the key word, for this year and maybe through the end of the decade when it comes to payments and building a payment strategy that delivers, as you say, as much mileage as possible for your business. It's about having partners that are willing to play well together and work in a collaborative way to drive the outcomes that you're looking for as a business, and increasingly sort of moving away from these one size fits all approaches to payments into ones that are more customizable, modular, plug and play together to accomplish specifically the priorities that you have on your desk as an enterprise.
And I would underscore the network piece of this as well. Again, if you have more partners, then your data set gets larger as well. You have access to more things. If you're doing everything individually in your silo, you're only going to see what you see in your customer base, right? So, for example, just using our example here in fraud, we see 9 out of 10 customers in the space. Right? So it could be that you're seeing this shopper for the first time in your website, but we Riskified have seen them in the network buying from another of our merchants. And that really helps you make better decisions and making sure that, again, you're avoiding a false decline because you don't know that customer. And if you're approving that customer, then you have a history for that shopper.
That brings to mind something like just the way we take in the news. Right? Like when it comes to that network effect, like, I love reading foreign affairs, love The Economist, right? But there's going to be some inherent skew in everything. And so by just broadening my scope, not taking in everything, right? Because that would be a disaster, but that just broadens and informs your own particular understanding. All right. So into our last section about predictions, actions, and some forward-looking prognostication into 2026. I guess all prognostication is forward-looking, right? False declines. It's not the first time, it's not the last time that you're going to be hearing about them, but just the level of scale and scope, especially as we're entering the agentic commerce age, where you have merchants who see sort of scrambled agentic activity on their website and are rejecting transactions. So you may have seen Visa just yesterday introduce their trusted agent protocol to help establish the veracity of an agentic buyer here. But let's get into this perennial issue and what the 2025 and 2026 take might be on it. Jordan, if I could put you on the spot.
I think the highest impact thing you can do as a business next year from an optimization standpoint is cracking the nut on false declines. I know it's something that Max and his team wake up probably every morning thinking about because it is such a big issue and there's so much opportunity associated with it. I mean, you can quite literally find several hundred basis points of revenue by just simply prioritizing this. And I think there's maybe a small number of areas within your business where you can find that level of opportunity sort of sitting in the proverbial couch cushions. And I would say the why now for this is simple, right? It's just such a big problem. It's a problem, as Max says, that's many multiples bigger than actual fraud losses experienced by businesses. Our estimates peg this as a $21 billion issue here in the US. And that's not impacted transactions, which would be a much bigger number. It's actual revenue that's being abandoned because the cardholder became frustrated by the decline and decided not to make the purchase or took their business elsewhere. And then you consider it's not just a threat to upfront sales and upfront revenue, it's a hit to customer lifetime value. 1 in 5 shoppers tell us they're going to abandon that purchase altogether or make it elsewhere after experiencing the false decline. So there's a risk that they don't return to your business in the future because they've had a better experience elsewhere. Pain on the issuer side as well. It's often talked about as a merchant-centric issue, but issuers are thinking about this too. They see it as a threat to volume. They see it as a threat to interchange revenue, a threat to top of wallet status. And so from a merchant standpoint, I think everybody needs to be obsessed about inadvertently impacting their best-in-class shoppers with basically their preventative efforts at the end of the day. And like everything in payments, it all comes back to data, right? The more you can do as a merchant to understand and segment your customer base and harness ecosystem intelligence, the better your decisions become, the better the outcomes start to be around this challenge.
And Max, as Jordan said, it's right in your wheelhouse. How would you build on that?
Yeah, I think the biggest quick win is changing how you think about the problem, right? If you manage risk and fraud mainly from a rules and patterns perspective, I can guarantee you're going to see an increase in false declines, and you're going to have a bigger issue. And again, like we talked about, actual fraud is a much smaller issue financially speaking than false declines themselves. And you should focus on the shopper identity instead, right? So we talked about identity confidence before, and that should be the angle. Confirming who's behind the transaction is way more important than fitting orders into static rules and thresholds that you may have in place. Because then you shift the narrative from being reactive to fraud to being proactive, right? It's less about timing the rules and it's more about trusting the right people and approving them every time. Now, I appreciate that this is complex, right? It's not an easy thing to do, to pinpoint the exact identity of whoever is buying from you. And again, if you don't have the infrastructure in place to change your model of how you approach fraud, then partner with someone who does, right? And we are obviously always happy to help with that problem.
And so we've exercised incredible restraint in not mentioning agentic payments. I know you can't have a payments webinar right now without touching on it. And we teased it a little bit with how it might look from a false declines perspective. But Jordan, part of your research was, and I know things have probably moved considerably since your enterprises first got some of these questionnaires. But let's jump in on how, where, and why merchants are adapting or adopting AI. And you had a great term as we were preparing for this. There's AI for payments, and then there's payments for AI. And I know we could do a 2-hour webinar on both of those things, but let's see if we can't give something meaningful in the next 6-7 minutes.
Yeah, we'll start with AI for payments, and specifically in the context of payment optimization. Seeing a lot of momentum building here. Just more and more enterprises that we're talking to are looking for partners that can help them unleash AI to drive improvements in conversions and costs and really across their overall payment operations. And we've seen that increase in focus build since we launched this study at the start of the decade. So 25% of enterprises planning to harness AI for payment optimization. When we first went into the field 5-6 years ago, it jumps up to 42% this year, as high as 57% for large enterprises. If we model that out to the end of the decade, we're looking at roughly 60% of enterprises looking to use AI in processing optimization. That would fail, of course, to take into consideration just that dramatic market-wide emphasis that we continue to see on all things AI. I'd expect that figure probably to be more in the high 70s to low 80s by the turn of the decade. And I'd say what really stood out to me in this year's survey is that payment processing optimization was actually the number 2 AI ML use case overall out of 20 plus different commerce related use cases that we served up to enterprises. So this is a topic that's getting attention within many enterprise merchants beyond just the payments team. There's a lot of eyeballs on this opportunity, and it can take all sorts of different forms. It could be authentication optimization to optimize for maybe SCA requirements. It could be dynamic payment method presentment based on the intelligence that you're collecting on your customers. Could be retries, it could be adaptive payment messaging, it could be reconciliation and cost observability. There's just so many ways to apply this technology to all things payments. And again, it all comes back to data. If you can centralize your data and structure it and layer it with cross-industry intelligence from a broader network of merchants, it's a lot easier to more effectively unleash AI to drive those measurable improvements, no matter where your focal point happens to be as an enterprise.
And from an orchestration layer, we can validate all of that, from especially the data elements. We just acquired a company called Congrify, which has really excellent capabilities for standardizing and structuring disparate streams of payment data for reconciliation, for business intelligence, and then deriving insights from that. So it really is just that booster shot, going back to the first slide we started with, and the customer data, the payments data as a potential growth inhibitor, but putting that to work. And then on the other side, as you mentioned, making sure that we're not going to lose any market share as a merchant, as with the adoption of agentic commerce and agentic buyers hitting our checkout.
I think that's a good point. From my perspective as well, there's a lot of companies building several protocols and rails to support this, right? Riskified included. So you have the networks, you have the processors themselves, you have the LLMs as well tapping into this, which is all very interesting. But a little of a provocative view on this as well. From my perspective, the data, again, is always going to be there. The data that we need to be able to assess a transaction is going to be there. We believe that we're going to have additional data points coming from agentic as well, which is always interesting. Mm-hmm. But this is never going to scale, right? Merchants are never going to fully utilize this until you have rules and regulation about where the liability is going to sit and who's going to be responsible for risk. And that's the big if, right? So I think everyone needs to be dialed into like what's being built now and what's being delivered by those companies to the market and getting ready for it. But a bigger question I think that we need to think about is how that's going to affect brands overall, right? I personally think that the LLMs are going to become the marketplace. Right, and so you're basically syndicating data. You're giving them access to your product catalog and your pricing, and it might be that they're going to charge fees to promote your product versus someone else's, and all the aspects of design, of front end development, and customer experience are not really there. And I think that's a much bigger question for everyone to think about than the actual payment piece of this. It will be regulated at some point, and everyone is going to know exactly how it's going to work.
And just actually going back to this one, I was so surprised to see 42%. And I know it climbs up a little bit with the bigger organizations to 57, but I was still so surprised it was that low. Probably some recency bias I was bringing in there, but especially as we're exploring the promises, and again, just in the last few weeks, seeing what agentic commerce can offer. I bet if you redid that survey element right now, that it would be considerably higher, but just me. And so rounding us out, and what you and your team at S&P have put together on key considerations and interest in specific agentic tokens and agentic commerce, Jordan.
Yeah, I mean, I want to build on a lot of the points that Max made because I thought they were excellent. And maybe if I just take a step back first, I sort of see these three broad eras that have unfolded in payments and commerce. Started off in this industry with the hardware era where commerce and payments really revolved around physical artifacts. It was like a physical checkout lane, a physical card, a physical payment terminal, and payments were very distinct, very visible within the customer journey. Where we've been for some time in the software era, we've seen the point of sale pretty much dissolve into anything that's connected. And we've seen the number of commerce moments, if you will, that can occur multiply as a result of that. Payments have become deeply intertwined with the customer experience. Payments have become a differentiator, as we've been talking about today. And where we're headed, the AI era, we're seeing a few things associated with this. One, payments are gaining greater intelligence. They're becoming more programmable. They're becoming more contextual, more delegated, more invisible. In an agentic commerce scenario that Max was sort of walking through there, the human can be removed entirely from the transaction. The AI agent acting and operating on our behalf as a consumer, that's a big paradigm shift for our industry. And it elevates the importance of really everything we've talked about today, right? You need payment infrastructure that's agile and adaptable, that can bridge you into these new environments. You need tools that can then optimize your payment stack as you start to see the number of sales channels you have as a business multiply. Securing and maintaining trust with your customers, that's never been more important as we head into agentic. And I would say larger merchants in particular are very intrigued about what agentic commerce could mean for their business. You see a bit of evidence of that on the slide here. There's a lot of interesting things associated with agentic commerce. You're talking about agents compressing the search to buy cycle down to seconds. They're filtering out noise and curating product options for your customers. That could give you conversion lift. As a merchant, you're perhaps getting very structured preference signals that are much higher converting than search. But there's a lot to think through. As Max was just saying, right? What does loyalty look like in this new era when agents are optimizing specifically on inputs like price? How are you optimizing your strategy, your product catalogs to treat agents as a distinct new customer segment for your business? As Max says, what's the impact on margins and how do you reconcile for that? Every merchant should be thinking through some of these considerations today, even if this still feels like it's a bit in the future. And at the end of the day, payments are the linchpin for all of this, right? You need partners that can connect you into these agentic platforms, help you ingest new fraud signals, leverage technologies like network tokens to secure your transactions, help you maintain your brand experience in these new environments. So again, I really think now is the time to be looking at your payment stack, at your payment partner ecosystem, and really evaluating where you're at today to compete in agentic commerce, because there's so much to think through. And again, that payments piece is such a critical enabler for bringing all this to life.
Yeah, the complexity predates the agentic protocols, right, around payments. Like there were already a lot of moving parts here, and now we have another dimension of that. Orchestrators and other partners can help abstract, right? Whatever the protocols in place, you can almost orchestrate between them. And not lose any sleep over that. And so rounding it out, man, we're already coming up on an hour. Time flies. So strategies and tactics for 2026. And I see we got one question that we can get to from the field right after this. But let's see. We talked about modularity and composability. How partners within the payment space can sit above all the layers touching the transaction itself, and can help streamline, whether from an authorization perspective, from a risk perspective, from a post-processing perspective, right? From a settlement and reconciliation standpoint. They can wrap that ecosystem to take out a lot of the complexity associated with building and maintaining all those individual features there. And as I just mentioned, and again, Max and Jordan, you teed up so well, the way that third parties can work across new developments like additional payment protocols around agentic commerce. We already mentioned Visa's Trusted Agent Protocol, Stripe's ACP, Google's AP2, that are going to really govern this development. I almost feel like it's in the early days of streaming services, where we had the promise of a single layer for all our streaming needs, and now everybody's getting their hand into the different protocols and capabilities and things like that. But as we wrap up and see if we have time for a question or two, Max, Jordan, what are you going to leave us with?
I'll go back to the agentic commerce piece, Andrew, and I would just say, while a lot of this feels like it's still so far off in the future, and there's so much to explore and consider, as you say, the market is probably going to increasingly fragment from here on out before we see any signs of consolidation around this trend. Now is the time to really be having those senior level strategy conversations within your organization around what the business impact is for your organization. a lot of great things we can associate with agentic, but I loved all the points that Max made, and I think it's very important to consider those implications for your business. What's your strategy to address the economic and the margin impact? How do you build relationships with your brand when you have more and more abstraction layers built between you and your customer? Those are the types of nuts to crack today before we even get to the point where meaningful volume is starting to flow through some of these platforms.
And I'll go back to the two concepts that we talked about. First, the adaptability and kind of composing with different partners, and the second, the identity confidence perspective. Right? I think between those two things, right, build and buy, you're going to be able to fix the bigger issue of them all. That is a reality today, which is again false to clients. Right? That's going to give you access to customize the flows based on your customer risk profile, treating different customers in a different way. VIPs, go right ahead, and then your more risky clients need to go through some additional checks, and I think that's fine. And making sure that you're approving as many orders as you can in a safely manner, and that you're cleaning your traffic to get better auth rates down the line as well.
Well, as we round this out, I'll bring it here for anybody who's jumping now that we're just past the hour. But if you heard anything you want to follow up with any of us on, just snap the QR codes, get in touch with us. And to play us out, we had a question here about what's the future of identity-based payments. So my verified digital identity will be my primary payment instrument in the future. So thank you for the question. In a lot of ways, I think of that as it's already here to some extent. If you're using your fingerprint on your phone or even your computer here, or I almost think of the way that if you go to a soccer match or Disney, you might get a wristband where somebody validated your identity, gave you a wristband, and then now that's sort of tappable everywhere within the ecosystem. And that with digital identity or identity-based payments, you're almost disintermediating that bracelet or something. But the payment method will have to be securely stored somewhere and linked by the different merchants accessing it. But Max, Jordan, what have you been thinking about in that space?
I agree with you. I think it's already here, and I also agree that it's going to be the future. So there's more that we can expand into when it comes to identity-based payments. For example, you have Google Pay and you have Apple Pay, which is based off of your Face ID, for example, of that confirmation. But we still see fraud from those payment methods, right? So you're still going to have issues regardless of using something like that in the future, because you have synthetic IDs, and that's just going to continue happening for us. I think the other aspect of the identity behind payments is going to be with things related to customer experience. So again, we don't only touch fraud, we also talk about returns and refunds abuse, right? There's a whole portion of this that is outside of payments, but is related to abuse and fraud, that if you have identity-based information as well, you can improve for many merchants and customers in the space.
All right. Well, to respect everyone's time, I think that's a great question to end on here. Had a few more, but at 2:05, I know we all got a lot to do today. But Max, Jordan, thank you so much for being on here today with us. Always keen on your feedback and the good work that you're up to at Riskified and S&P.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jordan.
And thank you everyone for joining. Again, follow up with any one of us. We'd be happy to chat on anything you heard today. Thank you.